The rotation has completely obliterated what we thought we knew about the Pokemon trading card game competitive scene. Old decks have fallen off the map and new decks have risen to take their place. And today we're going to look at the top 10 archetypes from the Sword and Shield metagame. Welcome back to the channel, little flexers. Thank you so much for clicking on today's video. My name is JW Crewall, aka Flex Daddy Righteous, and today I'm going to walk you through the top 10 decks of the Sword and Shield through Evolving Skies metagame. Now we're going to start off here number 10 with Decidueye. I'm going to put all of the names and their finishes from recent tournaments here underneath my head, and I'll also put all the deck lists down in the description for you guys to just copy and paste into PTCGO for your own convenience. It's going to make for a really long description, but I don't think you're going to mind. You're going to have all this information at the tips of your fingers. So why do I like Decidueye? Well, of course, it has that deep forest camo ability, which is always a pain if you're not prepared for it. Prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon V and Pokemon GX. Now, we're going to talk just about the standard format here. So since GXs have rotated, we're just focusing on those Pokemon V and Pokemon VMAX. A lot of decks don't really have a great answer to Decidueye. Now, there are a lot of decks that play an Inteleon engine and that play the quick shooting Inteleon, and that may also play water energy. But even so, those decks aren't a guaranteed win against Decidueye just because it takes so many resources to get those Inteleons powered up. It takes multiple turns, takes multiple energy, and Decidueye has more than a fair shot at being able to disrupt that kind of strategy. Then you look at the V and VMAX powered decks, things like Urshifu, things like Ice Rider, things like Shadow Rider. These decks all rely on the VMAX Pokemon heavily to be the main attackers, and Decidueye can catch them sleeping if they're not prepared for the matchup at all. So we also have here our Inteleon of our own, just so that we can do a little bit of extra damage. One thing that Decidueye really hurt with in the prior format was that it just didn't quite do enough damage. 90 to the active and then 20 to a couple of bench is okay, but the Inteleon line helps us boost that damage, right? Quick shooting on our end, if we can get one, maybe even two quick shooters down, all of a sudden we're boosting that damage a great deal and starting to really threaten the 2-shot or 3-shot on our opponent's Pokemon Vs or Pokemon VMAX. Drizzles are also really nice, helping us search out rare candy from the deck, being able to get up Decidueyes quicker and more efficiently than we may have been able to do in the past. And another card that I feel really helps the deck is Raihan. Now, we haven't ever had a good energy acceleration point for Decidueye. Could have maybe used Turbo Patch in the last format, but Raihan does so very effectively while also kind of furthering our goals of trying to get out multiple Decidueye. Raihan going to be really nice for this deck to be able to not only grab what we need to off of that search, but also be able to accelerate energy from the discard pile. I find that really nice to be able to stream those Decidueyes. Now, this deck, not the best deck because it's really just a counter deck, right? So if nobody's prepared for Decidueye, then it's going to do really well. And if everybody's prepared for it, well, then you're going to flop. It deserves a spot in this list, but I can't rank it much higher than number 10 because there's always going to be possible counters to the deck. Number 9 on our list is Zacian Zamazenta. Now, this deck gets a really big buff from the Crystal Cave that was just released. Once during each player's turn, that player may heal 30 damage from each of their Metal or Dragon Pokemon. So, of course, we're going to be using our main attackers as Zacian and Zamazenta, hence the name of the deck, and we're going to be able to tank out a lot of hits with that Crystal Cave. Now, Zacian and Zamazenta both have over 200 health, and that's going to be boosted here by the Cape of Toughness, giving each of them an additional 50 HP, which, when combined with the Crystal Cave and the possible switching between different attackers, means that your Zacians or your Zamazentas are going to be staying alive for a long time. Now, this deck is a pretty direct response to the snipe decks that we are going to see coming up later in this list, namely Jolteon and Dragapult, of which this Zacian and Zamazenta deck can tank a number of hits. You're going to be able to take a hit, move to the bench, heal off with the Crystal Cave. If your opponent doesn't have a boss's orders, then you're going to be able to do that maybe 2, 3, 4 times, and all of a sudden, all the effort that your opponent did to attack into that active is going to be nullified by the healing effects of your stadium. I also like that this deck can take full advantage of Raihan, another classic deck for this card. Raihan going to be able to put those metal energy back onto Pokemon wherever you need it and keep attackers going, which I find is one of the struggles of this deck. That's probably the main weakness, is that since Zacian has to switch every time it needs to attack, you need to be able to build up benched attackers, and that's where this deck falters. If it can't get up another attacker in that mid to late game, then you're not going to have a really good time. But I like it as an archetype. Ultimately, sweet and simple is sometimes the best answer. Ice Rider is a deck that we saw at the end of last format really rise to prominence. People were playing it with the Cobalion GX to get an extra turn with its GX attack. But now we get a couple of new cards here that really boost the effectiveness of the deck. Of course, we have Raihan and the Inteleon engine. That seems to be a common theme throughout this list, but we also get the Suicune V with its fleet-footed ability, makes this deck a little bit more consistent and also gives you a secondary non-VMAX option to attack with. So the Blizzard Rondo does 20 plus and does more damage based on the amount of benched Pokemon that each player has, meaning that if your opponent overbenches, then you can really punish them with a solid Blizzard Rondo for 220 damage, knocking out pretty much any V Pokemon. So this is a nice addition that I think is a little underlooked. You'll see some versions of this list cutting down on their VMAX line here of Ice Rider Calyrex and instead opting to kind of view the attackers as more of a Suicune based deck. One of the best cards in the deck is Path of the Peak, being able to block things like Shadow Rider Calyrex or Crobats that your opponent might try to play to draw more cards. Path of the Peak is just one of those cards that can swing the momentum of the game. What we're really lacking right now in the standard format are comeback cards, but Path of the Peak is one of those that maybe when combined with the hand disruption of Marnie can really bring you back from the brink of defeat to maybe steal a win. Path of the Peak belongs in this deck because the Ice Rider VMAX just doesn't have an ability that it needs to lean on, and since we're going to be using that attacker more often than not, we can afford to play Path of the Peak. Now, of course, that does shut off our Suicune ability, but drawing one extra card versus having Path of the Peak out to disrupt the opponent is a pretty fair trade-off in my opinion. Some of the issues with the deck are that it maybe isn't fast enough, maybe doesn't do enough damage. If you look at the attackers in the deck, nobody can hit more than 250 damage. So if you're looking at some of the weaknesses of the deck, besides being weak to metal with, of course, the Zacian decks running around, it just doesn't swing for as hard as you might want it to. Now, we've seen Suicune decks that are playing things like Ludicolo to try to make up for that little bit weaker damage output. And of course, these decks are playing that Inteleon with quick shooting to try to boost the damage. But just be warned that if you are playing against other VMAX decks that you don't, have weakness on, you might be up for an uphill climb here just because of the low damage output. That said, this deck's use of Path of the Peak plus its combination of versatile attackers earns it the number 8 slot on our list. I really just don't know quite what to think about Leafeon. On the one hand, it seems like it has everything going for it, being able to accelerate energy to itself and attack for high damage for relatively little cost. On the other hand, there are a lot of ways to play around the strategy of Leafeon that it seems like it's in this kind of weird mix of being potentially good, but then potentially being outplayed, if that makes any sense. So let me talk you through that a little bit. Of course, we got the Leafeon V. One of the best things about this deck is this ability here, Greening Cells. It says, once during your turn, you may search your deck for an energy card and attach to one of your Pokemon, grass energy card, of course. Then shuffle your deck. If you use this ability, your turn ends. So it's kind of like an automatic Zacian ability, but you don't get to draw any cards. You're just attaching energy. That's really nice because it means that you're going to, pretty much in every game, be guaranteed a Grass Knot on the next turn. Now, Grass Knot is both an extremely strong attack and also a very played around attack. So Grass Knot here does 60 damage for each star in your opponent's active retreat cost. So you think about some of those fatties in the standard metagame here, where you have like Eternatus with 3 retreat, Shadow Rider, Calyrex with 2 retreat. You know, there's a lot of Pokemon that have high retreat, but at the same time, you know, they could play something like an air balloon to negate a couple of those retreat stars in their retreat cost. You, on the other hand, can play Galar Mine. So the retreat cost of both active Pokemon is 2 more. So you have this kind of interplay, right? Because the opponent is trying to play their, you know, low retreat attackers, right? If they have a choice, maybe they go in with, you know, for instance, a Suicune over an Ice Rider to try to mitigate how much damage you're doing at the Grass Knot. And then they can also attach an air balloon, right? But you, of course, have Galar Mine and another secret weapon in the Tool Jammer. So Tool Jammer, as long as the card this is attached to is in the active spot, Pokemon tools have no effect on your opponent's side of the field, except for Tool Jammer. So this is a kind of a weird interplay that I feel like means that Leafeon is good against certain decks, and certain decks that maybe aren't prepared for it, and very bad against other ones where the deck is either prepared for it or they already have as a main attacker low retreat cost. One of the things that Leafeon does very well is 2-shot VMAXs. But if it ever has to attack into Pokemon V, again, like the Suicune, for instance, then it's going to have a rougher time because Suicune and other basic V Pokemon only have that 1 retreat. And even if they boost the retreat cost with the Galar Mine, if it has 1 retreat and you're boosting it by, you know, 2, then the Grass Knot is only going to do 180 damage, which still isn't enough for a 1-shot knockout. Now, of course, you do have the Inteleon engine, so you can get those quick shooting abilities down and boost your damage that way. But just know that as basic V attackers rise, again, as Suicune rises in prominence, Leafeon might not be as well poised as it was when VMAXs were the only attackers that anyone was considering. Coming in at number 6 on our list is Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX. Now, the reason I don't have Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX a little bit higher on this tier list is because it's kind of being hated out of the metagame by its weaknesses. Now, we always knew that Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX had weakness to Dark, meaning that it was going to be more than likely one-shot by things like Eternatus and Moltres V. But now we're also seeing a rise in Metal-type Pokemon, meaning that all of a sudden Alchemy VMAX is in trouble. And that's not a good thing when you have your two main attackers here, both weak to very prominent types in the format. You're really trying to hope that you can get one turn, right, of your opponent having to attack into an Alcremie or into a Shadow Rider Calyrex, but to have those weaknesses be so prevalent in the metagame right now, it's just a tough thing for this deck to deal with. Add on to the fact that another archetype we're going to see later on in the list is gaining in prominence in the single strike Umbreon decks. You have kind of a deck that was very highly thought of and is still quite good, but maybe isn't as well poised here in our top 10 as it once was. So going through the archetype real quick, we get some new cards here in the Galarian Articuno with its Cruel Charge. I love this card in this deck. I don't think that you can play this deck without it, just because you get to accelerate those 2 extra energy. One thing that we saw from this deck in the past format was that the Gengar and Mimikyu would be able to Horror House, and so that you could get an extra turn of attachments. Well, we lose the Gengar Mimikyu to rotation, so now we have to have some other way to accelerate that energy. Galarian Articuno is the best way to do it. I also really like the addition of Pumpkaboo with the Pumpkin Pit ability. It allows us to replace a Stadium in play, just discard it from play when we play Pumpkaboo down onto our bench. I think it's very much needed because we've already looked at a few archetypes already that have Path to the Peak and that utilize it as a 4 count. We're going to need to get rid of that, of course. So we have training courts of our own to bump those paths, but it's really nice to have that searchable card in the Pumpkaboo that can be searched out with the Fog Crystals or the Quick Balls, that we can just go search whenever we really need that turn of abilities, which we're always going to need, because that's kind of the end game of this deck, is to get a bunch of energy into play and either attack with the Shadow Rider VMAX or the Alchemy VMAX. So love this deck. I think it's still really playable in this format, but maybe not as great as it once was, when I would have said, maybe at the start of the metagame here, I would have said it's the number 1 or the number 2 deck. I think there's a lot more dark attackers that are becoming more and more viable. Here at number 6, we have Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX. Staying alive at number 5 is Rapid Strike Urshifu. Now, Rapid Strike Urshifu, I shouldn't need to introduce this card, but I will for those of you that may not know what it does. Gale Thrust is going to do 150 damage if this Pokemon moves from the bench to the active during your turn, and then Gmax Rapid Flow is going to snipe 120 to 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon, with the drawback being that you have to discard all energy attached to your Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX. Now, those are 2 very powerful attacks, and we're going to supplement that damage output with a couple of other attackers here. We got Galarian Moltres V, which can accelerate energy, which we can then energy switch off, or just attack with Aura Burn in and of itself, doing 190 damage, and of course knocking out those dark weak Pokemon in one hit. And then we also have Blaziken VMAX here with the Max Blaze attack, going to be able to accelerate energy from the discard pile onto our VMAXs to go ahead and rapid flow turn after turn. Now, I like this deck a lot because of the various options. You got Fire type that you can hit those Zacian and Zamazentas into. We got the Fighting type, which you can knock out Jolteons. You can knock out, all of the Eternatus decks, anything that's fighting weak. And then, of course, you have the Galarian Moltres, which is going to take care of all those dark weak Pokemon, most notably the Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX. So you got a lot of type coverage here, which is super cool. You also have an Inteleon line to boost that damage, quick shooting. I'm going to sound like a broken record for sure, but that is going to be able to augment the damage that you're already doing. Now, what I love about this deck as well is that, again, like a broken record, it's going to be able to utilize Raihan very, very effectively. Every time one of your opponent's Pokemon knocks out one of your Pokemon, you can go ahead and accelerate an energy, and you might just be that much closer to getting a consecutive Gmax Rapid Flow off, which is one of the strongest attacks in the game, being able to potentially take 6 prizes in one turn. I love it. I love this deck. I love the options that it provides, and it comes in at our number 5 slot here on our top 10. Jolt Dog in the house. We got Jolteon VMAX coming in at number 4. What I love about Jolteon VMAX, and ignore that I don't actually own any of the Jolteon VMAXs, but I have seen this deck played a ton by my good friend Andrew Mahone over on Tricky Gym, both in person and on the client. So I love about Jolteon just the fact that it snipes. I mean, we haven't had this much snipe potential through the game in the form of Dragapult or Jolteon or Rapid Strike Urshifu in a long time. I think that's really neat how they've worked in these snipe attacks to not necessarily be the main focus, but to be a focus of, kind of a healthy metagame. They're not the decks that are only playable. They're not playable. I think snipes just fit in very nicely to kind of the landscape of the game. And so Max Thunder Rumble, 100 damage, also does 100 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon that needs to have damage counters on it. So you have to have damage counters to make full use of this Pokemon's attack, but that's fine because we got a couple of ways to do that. Of course, we got the quick shooting Inteleon. You're going to hear me say it a few more times. And then we also have Zigzagoon with the Headbutt Tantrum, is just going to allow us to pick one of your opponent's Pokemon and be able to do the boosted damage from the Jolteon. One of the things that is super nice about the deck is that it can utilize speed energy, and it can attack for 1 energy via Elemental Badge. If the Pokemon V this card is attached to has Vaporeon, Jolteon, or Flareon in its name, its attack costs 1 less. So that's really nice because it means we can use Max Thunder Rumble for, of course, the 1 energy. Now, this deck's main advantage is being able to pick off the opponent's Drizziles or Sobbles. So you're asking yourself, why would I play Jolteon over something else? Well, we've kind of seen the Rapid Strike Urshifu's prominence kind of on the decline. And so Jolteon seems like a very viable option because all of these decks are playing those Inteleon engines. You're going to be able to feast on the Sobbles and Drizziles that your opponent might put down. So if you're heading into a tournament and you think that there's going to be a lot of Inteleon players there, people that are playing Inteleon engines, then Jolteon might just be the best choice for you. It's got a lot of versatility, can heal very simply. Of course, we got Cheryl in this deck that doesn't have as much of an impact in this deck as opposed to other VMAX decks, because we only have the one energy that we need to, attach onto the Jolteon VMAX in combination with the Elemental Badge to be able to attack in the future. Now, one cool thing about Katron's list is that he played a Chatot with the Lucky Match ability. When you play this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench during your turn, you may flip a coin. If heads, put a supporter card from your discard pile into your hand. So that's just a way to be able to reuse Cheryl, be able to reuse a boss's orders, and maybe free up a little bit of space. Of course, you can go ahead and scoop up net that Chatot as well, and it just gives you a little extra consistency. Now, it is on a flip, but the fact that you could pull out any supporter and just bring it back to hand is not one that we often see in these decks. You'll also notice here that we have Marnie and Path of the Peak. If you can get a quick Path of the Peak and disrupt your opponent's hand, then you're probably going to be in a really good spot to win the game. Jolteon is such a low maintenance card that Path of the Peak and Marnie make a lot of sense. You don't really need to have a big hand here, and you can always search out what you are missing with the Drizziles. But Path of the Peak and Marnie, one of the most dangerous and potent combinations in our standard format, and I think Jolteon is one of the decks better poised to utilize that. Before we head into our top 3, if you've made it this far in the video and you've been enjoying the content, I'm going to ask you to do 3 things of your own. Please make sure to like the video. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell notification icon to get notifications of when I post in the future. It would help me out a lot, and we're on pace to hit 5,000 subscribers here soon. So please be a part of the journey and help this channel to grow. Here we are at our top 3 decks for today. This one comes from Stefan Ivanov, who won a recent Celio Stats tournament with his Single Strike deck. Now, there's a lot to love about this Single Strike deck, most notably that you can one-shot anything. Yeah, hello. Gmax 1 Blow on this Single Strike Urshifu is just a monster of an attack, dealing 270 base damage, but being able to, with the attachment of these Single Strike energies, to boost that damage up 20, 40, 60, be able to get those knockouts on pretty much anything in the game right now. We also have a lot of access to our opponent's bench with this Umbreon VMAX Dark Signal. When you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during your turn, you may switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active. It's a nice gusting effect, means we don't have to rely solely on boss's orders to pick off opponent's bench Pokemon. This can be quite devastating to an opponent to have a Sobble knocked out on turn 2, or to be able to bring up a Pokemon that they're trying to build up on their bench as kind of a late attacker. It's really just a strong ability for any Pokemon to have, and to be able to have this on Umbreon, of which you play a couple counts of, is really, really nice. You get the opportunity to do that at least twice in a game, as well as, of course, Boss, which we also play in the deck. Now, don't overlook Max Darkness. Umbreon VMAX is a Single Strike Pokemon, which means that our Houndoom can accelerate energy to it. What I love about this deck is that it's really well poised to do well in a VMAX dominated metagame. Now, we have been talking a lot about those 2 prize attackers, Zacian, Zamazenta deck, or the Suicune V deck, but in a metagame that is primarily dominated by VMAX Pokemon, you just have it all covered. You can bring up opponent's Pokemon with the Umbreon and kind of swing into things that they're trying to build up. Some of the VMAX Pokemon, of course, are going to need a few turns to power up. Something like a Shadow Rider Calyrex VMAX is a little bit difficult to get powered up in one turn. You can bring that into the active and one-shot it. You can also just go through whatever they have active with the Single Strike Urshifu VMAX, one-shotting pretty much any VMAX in the game. So I love this deck. I think it's a great call for any tournament that you go to, especially if you think that everyone's going to be playing VMAX decks. Our number 2 deck here today is Dragapult, which controls the opponent's board unlike any other deck on the list. Of course, Dragapult has a snipe attack in Max Phantom that does 130 damage to the active and allows you to place 5 damage counters any way you like on your opponent's side of the field, which can be very potent. Of course, we think about a lot of decks running the Inteleon lineup, and what do those Inteleons involve? From And that's right, Drizzile. And what do Drizziles evolve from? That's right, Sobble. So Sobble has 60 HP. So when you have a Max Phantom doing 50 damage counters and then follow that up with a Zigzagoon beforehand, that's 60, enough to wipe a Sobble clear off the field. That's really strong. Of course, you can pair that with Boss's Orders. Maybe you can take out 2 Sobble at once, and all of a sudden you've crippled your opponent's draw. Another way to cripple your opponent's draw is with Path to the Peak. Seems to keep coming up, and for good reason. Path to the Peak being able to shut off Crobats, so now you're being able to cut off the Sobble evolution lines, and then cut off their Crobats, and then even disrupt the hand with a Marnie. Marnie and Path to the Peak, a perfect combination. Now, this deck does get a couple of fantastic new cards for it. Again, we keep talking about Raihan being that way that these decks can accelerate that extra energy to get another attacker into play. That's one of the things that Dragapult can really struggle with if they do not get an extra energy down in that early game. Then they can struggle in the later stages of the game trying to get another Dragapult VMAX up. Well, Raihan kind of takes care of that by itself, being able to accelerate that extra energy when your opponent takes a knockout. We also have, of course, Fog Crystal, which increases the consistency of this deck. It's already a pretty low maintenance deck as it stands, but Fog Crystal is going to be able to pick out the piece in that early game that we just don't have in our hand, be it the energy or the Dragapult V. I love Dragapult VMAX heading into the thick of our format because it controls the board so well and because it preys on opponents' Sobbles so nicely. And you got Path to the Peak. I feel like you're never really out of it when you have that card in play. So Dragapult VMAX coming in at number 2, one of my top choices here for this Sword and Shield to Evolving Skies metagame. And our top deck, Suicune Ludicolo. Who would have thought that this crazy looking, I don't even know what you call it, salsa dancing, sombrero wearing, grass water freak of nature would make such an impact on the game, but it certainly has. Anytime I play a Ludi down onto my bench, I gotta yell, Ludi! You can take or leave that, at the door here. But Ludicolo is going to boost our basic Pokemon's attack damage by 100 when it gets played. Of course, these Ludicolo are able to stack, which is kind of cool. You could potentially do up to 200 damage with a Suicune V, or potentially up to 200 more damage with like a Lotad. I mean, it doesn't say which basic Pokemon you have to attack with, but our main attacker is going to be that Suicune V that has that Blizzard Rondo. Blizzard Rondo normally going to be able to two-shot in most cases, but your opponent can always play around by not dropping enough bench Pokemon to hit for any meaningful damage. You're always going to have your bench, which you're trying to fill with other Suicunes, Lotads, and Sobbles, but of course your opponent can choose whether or not to bench what they need. We can get around that a little bit, and what I like about this list, we can get around that with the Echoing Horn, put a basic Pokemon from your opponent's discard pile onto their bench. I really think that Echoing Horn should be a card that should be more utilized in these Suicune decks to control what your opponent has in play and to be able to do a little bit more damage. I mean, when you think about it, an Echoing Horn at the right time is basically just a plus 20 on your damage output here from Blizzard Rondo. So I like playing it in this deck a lot. And of course, it is that item card that can be searched out with the Inteleon engine. We get boosts here from Raihan, of course. Cape of Toughness is going to be nice for keeping our Suicunes alive. But overall, this is just a very solid deck that can two-shot a lot of the format while not always taking 2 shots in return. You can think of a Suicune V having that Cape of Toughness at 270 HP. Sure, it might get 1 shot, but more than likely it's going to be 2 shot. And so Suicune really trades nicely into a lot of the VMAX decks. Add in that ability to draw extra cards. You got Melanie for energy acceleration. You got the Inteleon line with the quick shooting, doing a little bit of extra damage, and that coalesces to form one of the best decks in the metagame. So that is our top 10 list from the Sword and Shield to Evolving Skies metagame. What do you guys think? Agree? Disagree? Think some decks should have been rated higher? Lower? Well, let me know down in the comments below after you've subscribed and hit that bell notification icon. That's going to be all for me today, guys. If I don't see you soon, I'll see you later. And remember, good luck and also have fun.